Well, let's turn our Bibles to the 83rd Psalm, Psalm 83. Give you an easy book to find. Big one right in the middle of the Bible. Psalm 83, verse 1. Keep not thy silence, O God, hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God, for lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. The tabernacles of Edom, and the Ishmaelites, of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gebal, and Ammon, and Amalek, the Philistines, with the inhabitants of Tyre. Assyria also is joined with them. They have helped the children of Lot, Selah. Do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera and to Jabin at the brook of Kishon, who perished at Endor. They became as dung for the earth. Make their nobles like Oreb, and like Zeb, yea, all their princes, as Zebah, and as Zalmunna. Now this is a psalm that was written by Asaph, and he was calling upon God to protect Israel against their enemies. And notice he calls the enemies of Israel the enemies of God, because this was God's people. Now the interesting thing about this, if you were to take the geographical locale of each of these peoples that are named here, you would find that they constitute exactly the same geographical areas as those nations who are saying this same thing today. As a matter of fact, if you had read your newspaper just before what we commonly call the 6-Day War now, and you could have read this in verse 5, for they have consulted together with one consent, and they are confederate against thee. Or fourth verse, they have said, Come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. Now, Israel, as we talked about last time, occupies a very favored land. God calls it his land, his own land. And this, of course, is Palestine in New Testament times, but the color scheme helps you find it here. The promised land for Jacob and his descendants were these three parts that you see in yellow, purple, and pink. And this was Judah, and this was Samaria, and this was Galilee. But those three areas there constitute what we generally speak of as the land. And this is the Jordan River, of course, bordering on the east, the mountains of Lebanon on the north, the Mediterranean Sea on the west, and the deserts of Sinai on the south. A very well protected land. And these people that we read about here would just surround that land. For instance, let's start in 6th verse. The tabernacles of Edom. Well, this is Edom right down here. This is the same as this Idune. That's what it was called in New Testament times. But this is Edom. And then the next we have the Ishmaelites. That's all of the Arabs, the nomadic type Arabs. And then next we have the Hagarenes, which are kin to the Ishmaelites. Hagar was Ishmael's mother. And then Gebal was just between Edom and Moab. Ammon was the next one up, Amalek was right down in here. The Philistines were what we know now as the Gaza Strip, in that area. Tyre was what we know as Lebanon. Assyria is what we would now know as, eastern Syria and northern Iraq. And then the children of Lot are Ammon and Moab. And on down, the Midianites would be down in this area, just below where our map is here. But the same people that 1,000 years before Christ were trying to push Israel into the sea, so to speak, are the same people that are trying to do it today. And God says, no, I have a special people and I have a special land, and the special land is for the special people, regardless of the United Nations or the League of Arabs or the Palestinian commandos or what have you. And eventually this is exactly the way it'll be. Now you recall that this land became the land of Israel as a result of a promise that God had made to Abraham. God had tried man for 10 generations, from Adam to Noah, and had sent his prophets among them. The seventh from Adam, Enoch, preached the coming of the Lord, we read in the book of Jude. And they had been preached to by the preachers that God sent, but they went further and further away until by the 10th generation there were only 8 people in all the world that regarded God. And so to preserve the human race, they'd become so wicked, and to preserve the human race, God brought about the flood and brought through 8 people, all of whom regarded God. But in just 10 more generations, that is the 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, again, all of mankind turned away from God. And in order to have a witness for himself, God had to call a man out of an idolatrous family. According to Joshua, Abraham was called out of an idolatrous country. And he says, I'm going to make me my own special people. Of course, this is why Abraham and Sarah had to wait until after they were of the age which they could bear children, because God brought about a miraculous son in Isaac. And so it's from Isaac that God brought about his people. He rejected Isaac's first son as being fleshly and not spiritually minded, and he chose his second son. And that's why to be a true Israelite, you must be descended from not only Abraham, but Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so he says, I want to give you this special land. What I want to do there, I want to bring you into the land and instruct you, let you know what kind of a God I am, and equip you to tell all the world about me. And he says, when you have possessed the land and learned enough, I will enlarge your borders. Now, we pointed out before, it confuses some to find 2 distinct sets of borders for the land of Israel. One narrow set and one larger set of borders. The narrow one was this one that we just described here, or primarily where Egypt is today. Where Israel is today, if you were to cut off the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. The rest of what they occupy would be this narrow confinement. It was God's idea to bring them into that, and then to expand them from, as they said, from the river Euphrates, all the way down to the river of Egypt, a much larger land. Now, they weren't too happy with that, and they wanted to expand before they wanted to be grown up before they grew up, and so they spread out over into part of the land that God eventually intended for them. So you actually have 3 borders, or 3 boundaries for Israel. You have the narrower boundary where he wanted to bring them in first to instruct them. It would be their own land. Then you have the borders of the land which they actually occupied because they thought that the land that God had in mind for them was too small. And then you have the land that God had eventually intended for them to have, which they never have possessed in its entirety because they decided they didn't want to do it God's way. So actually, some people get confused that there are actually 3 sets of borders prescribed for the land of Israel. 2 that were in God's mind, the initial and the ultimate, and one that was of their own choosing. Now, we're talking about now, when we're talking about going into the land, only the narrower one, because that's where they were supposed to start from. And we pointed out before that in a semicircle around the southern edge of this land, there were some 7 tribes. And on the inside of the land, there were 7 other tribes. Now here again, this is rather confusing, because sometimes when God is listing the tribes in this land here, he lists 10, sometimes 7, sometimes 6, sometimes 3, and sometimes only 1. And there's reasons for all of this. We'll try to review that just briefly. When he gives 10, it's that area which they actually occupied. 7 is the smaller area. And sometimes he calls it all the land of the Canaanites, because all of these people in here were descendants from Canaan. And sometimes it's called the land of the Amorites, because they were the strongest or the greatest of the 7 that were within there. So there's the tribes inside of the line. So God told Abraham that his immediate progeny would not be permitted to occupy the land, because, he put it, the iniquity of the Amorites. He says the people are going to get so wicked, delete them out. He says the land. And he says, that's the reason I'm going to give it to you. It's not because you're so good. It's not because you're a great nation. It's not because you really deserve it. It's because I can't stand the stench. I'm going to put up with it so long, and when I won't put up with it anymore, I'm going to spew them out. Spew you out. Now, it's interesting to know that when we deal with the 7 tribes inside the land, God instructed the Israelites to absolutely obliterate them. Man, woman, and child. Every living one of them. See, God already foreknew that not a one of them would ever come to him. And to let them live and keep on bringing up progeny would simply, we'll say, raise up more fodder for hell. And as a matter of fact, it would be a gracious thing on God's part if a little child that had just been born into one of these iniquitous families were not permitted to live, because then he would never be able to grow up and heap up all the judgment to himself. So let's not start condemning God and say, oh, what a mean God to do away with those people. It's the same thing as in the days of Noah. If God hadn't have done that, and that was man, woman, and child, just think of those little tiny children just screaming their heads off as they saw the water coming down and so forth. You say, well, what a cruel God. That's a lot less cruel than to have let that same little child grow up in iniquity and heap all that judgment upon himself. See, we don't think like God thinks. His ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. He knows how to run his business. So let him run his business. He knows how to run it. Well, it's interesting to note that when we're talking about these 7 tribes inside, the children of Israel are instructed to completely obliterate them. But when we're talking about the ones on the outside, it's the battle is the Lord's. And they're never told to just completely destroy them. For instance, about the Philistines, they're right on there. Generations later, in the time of the later kings, they're still there. The second tribe here was the Amalekites. And God said, you'll have war with the Amalekites from generation to generation until God gets ready to completely do them in. And when it came to the Edomites, he said, I don't want you to destroy the Edomites. I've given them a land, and I want them to keep it. And I don't want you to destroy the Moabites or the Ammonites. So this is an interesting observation, that they weren't to completely destroy the tribes. Remember, when they came up against the Philistines, they came up against the Amalekites, the Midianites, the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites. But as soon as they came up against the Amorites, or those within, it's every one of them, completely. Well, that's significant, isn't it? Or it has some significance. Whether we discover the significance or not, it is still significant. Now, the people that were inside of the land were all descendants of Canaan, who was cursed. Remember the story of Canaan, how that when Noah came off of the ark with his 3 sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, that Ham saw his father naked and dishonored him. And so God said that one of his sons would be accursed. Now, not all of his children, one of his sons, and that son was Canaan. Now, as near as you can tell from the genealogies given in the 10th chapter of Genesis, Canaan had 11 sons. And all of these people inside of the land here were Canaan's sons, except the Philistines, which we're going to see hold a peculiar place, and by that same genealogy, they were not the sons of Canaan, but the sons of Canaan's brother. They had the same grandfather, you might say, all these people, or that is to say, Ham was the progenitor of all of them, but the Philistines were not descendants from Canaan. But all of those who were descendants from Canaan, they were to be completely obliterated. Now, if you want the true significance of the curse on Canaan, it has nothing to do with the color of a person's skin whatsoever. The colored race, almost undoubtedly, are Hamitic. That is, they came from Ham, but they did not come from Canaan. There probably today are no survivors of Canaan, the one who was accursed. And that wasn't treating Canaan bad. God simply knew that Canaan would turn from him into utter wickedness. In the Bible, you'll see Canaan stands for absolute immorality. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, for instance, were inhabited by Canaanites, or the descendants of Canaan. And they're just completely reprobate, interested only in gratifying the lowest fleshly nature, and absolutely destitute of any spiritual propensities whatsoever. God foreknew this, and he therefore was going to use this as an example. And so when it says that cursed be Canaan, it means cursed is moral degradation. That's what God is saying in typical language. And that's what Canaan represents. And that's why they were to be obliterated completely, all of these children of Canaan. Because they, wherever they were left, and many of them were left, they brought Israel into the same horrible degradation. The type of sins that you don't even name in mixed company. If you want to read about the type of sin we're talking about, just read the last 4 chapters of Judges, because that's the type of sin that the Canaanites drew the Israelites into when they married their sons and daughters. You can get the picture in Judges, in the book of Judges, as they went down, down, down morally. So this is what's to be obliterated before we can really serve God. Remember, God is bringing the Israelites into this land. They might know Him and understand Him, and then take His message of holiness throughout the world. But these around here stand for something else. And there's no place in the Bible that I know of where it says the Philistines stand for so forth, the Amalekites stand for so forth, the Edomites stand for so forth. You simply take all of the scriptures, and there's so much scripture. You can just go into your concordance and look up Philistines, for instance, or a Bible dictionary, and you can read for the next week on all the scriptures that have to do with the Philistines. And when you see God writing that much about something, you can say, well, this has a significance for me. How do you know? Because God said, 1 Corinthians 10:11, all these things happened to them, the Israelites, for example, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world have come. It has a significance for us. And that's what we're going to try to do, search out the significance. Now, we've done quite a lot of this already, haven't we? But we want to continue this and to find out what we can about the Philistines. So let's name these tribes again. Number one, right over against the Mediterranean Sea, you have the Philistines. And let's give a little background on them. The Philistines, we'll take this again. Here's the land we're talking about, and we'll just kind of take this semicircle around here, and we start over here with Philistia, or the land of the Philistines. And I'll give you a rough outline or a little preview of what my study has revealed that each of these stand for, and then we'll go to the Scriptures and try to prove it. As best I know, the Philistines, as we've said before, stand for false Christianity, or so to speak, what we would call, you might even say, neo-orthodoxy, or that which holds itself out to be orthodox Christianity, but they have a form of godliness and deny the power thereof. They're the people who the world recognizes as the Christian spokesman. They're those, as we say, they're those that say, well, we don't need to go into Egypt and cross the Red Sea and go through the wilderness to get into the Promised Land. We're already here. They're not interested in being born again, saying I'm a lost sinner. They're not interested in applying the blood of the Lamb to the doorpost of their heart. They're already there from an observable standpoint. Now, historically, the Philistines, as we say, were descended from Ham, but not from Canaan. Whereas the ones that are in the land, the 7 tribes in the land, for instance, when Paul is preaching his sermon in the 13th chapter of Acts on his first missionary journey, he speaks about this matter of the 7 tribes that were in the land. And he says 7 tribes, and he's not talking about the Philistines. He's talking about the 7 that are listed, for instance, in Deuteronomy 7:1. Moses listed them there for you, if you want to read them yourself. I don't know if I can call them all off, but there were the Jebusites, the Amorites, and the Hittites, and the Hivites, and the Perizzites, and the Girgashites, and the Canaanites, or in other words, all of the other Canaanites that are not listed by the other 6. That's why sometimes you see just 6. The term Canaanite enveloping all the other descendants of Canaan that weren't included in the other 6, because, see, he had 11 sons altogether. And it's just that those 6 became distinct nationalities, and then all the rest of them weren't as distinct. And so when you see the 7 listed, you'll always see 6 and then the Canaanites. But they're all Canaanites. Every one of them is descended from Canaan. So it's telling you about the descendants of 6 of Canaan's sons, and then all the rest of the Canaanites is the thought that we want to have there. So we find that the Philistines were not of those. They were sons of Ham, but not sons of Canaan. And so they're not included when we speak of the 7 tribes that inhabited the land of Canaan. They were not Canaanites, but they were in the land, you might say, without any authority. They just barged in themselves. And there's more about them in the Bible than any of the other of these tribes. And they last all through. We'll see some more of that as we go along. And they were always the enemies of God's people. Now, if you want to see the change of scenery and see the great grace of God displayed, think about this. In the 8th chapter of Acts, when God wants to take his message of grace and salvation outside of the scope of Israelites, remember, all of the people who were saved in the first years of the church era, beginning at the day of Pentecost, were Jews, or Jewish proselyte, or those who had some affinity to Jews, like the Samaritans and so forth. And the first individual to whom salvation was taken outside of that group was a Hamite, a descendant of Ham, and he was saved right in the land of the Philistines. right in the Gaza Strip. They were in Gaza. He was going through Gaza, which is one of the 5 cities of the Philistines, on his way down to Ethiopia. And God saved him. Just to show you that God loves all of his creatures, and he's not mad at any of them. And he's not cursing anybody from the standpoint of he won't have anything to do with them because of what they are. It's because he foreknows their reaction to his invitation that he curses somebody or hardens their heart, as he did with Pharaoh. But it's a beautiful story to see when God wants to reach out with the gospel beyond the Jewish community. He first goes right to that land, the greatest enemies of God's people all through the centuries. And he goes right to there and saves by the power of God and through the message of an Israelite, the evangelist Philip. He saves a descendant of Ham in the land of the Philistines. Isn't that interesting? Well, you know, I was once a Philistine, and God came and saved me right while I was there. So, from a spiritual standpoint, I was a Philistine. So God is not mad at the Philistines. It's the Philistines that say, in Psalm 83, for instance, let's shove God's people off the face of the earth. Fact is, when God's people are raptured out of this earth, it's going to be the Philistines that'll have the answer. They'll be the ones that'll say, now you people, look, you regard us, because God was not pleased with these fundies, and he's obliterated them. They're going to have the answer for the world, because they're the ones to whom the world looks to now as Christianity. Well, anyway, I thought that would be interesting to you, that old Ethiopian eunuch was the first man that God took the gospel to. Now, we've mentioned this before, I know, but I can't help but bring it out again. Remember, in the 8th chapter of Acts, you have the gospel going to a descendant of Ham from the continent of Africa, and in the 9th chapter, you have the conversion of a descendant of Shem from the continent of Asia, and in the 10th chapter, you have the gospel message reaching the heart of a descendant of Japheth from the continent of Europe. Just like God told the people to physically spread out into all the world, he also, as he sent the gospel into all the world, he reached immediately one from each of the 3 major divisions of the tribes of the world, Ham, Japheth, and Shem, and from the 3 inhabited continents of the world. So let's just get out of our mind that God's mad at any particular body. In fact, as a matter, many Canaanites were saved eventually as they came into David's kingdom and so forth. We'll see as we go along. But as a people, they were to be obliterated because of what they represented, that moral degradation. And so the 7 tribes that are in the land represent that which would keep us from enjoying our abundant Christian life and having fulfillment in it. And it's those things in our life which bring about moral degradation. For instance, pride, covetousness. And notice, these are things which we're to do something about. What do we do about pride? Humble thyself under the mighty hand of God, and he shall exalt you in due time. We're supposed to do something about pride. Now, we go to God for its attention, but you get the picture maybe from the book of Colossians. See? Chapter 3, verse 5. Mortify therefore your members which are upon earth. Mortify them or put them to death. Fornication, uncleanness. We're talking about these that inhabited the land before God's people did. This is describing Canaanites. Fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, We're reading from Colossians 3:5. Evil desire, this concupiscence means just an intense desire to clutter your mind with whatever is sensual and so forth. Covetousness, which is idolatry, for which things' sake the wrath of God cometh upon the children of disobedience. This is why God had his curse upon Canaanites, because this describes them perfectly. Notice in the 10th verse, and have put on the new man, that is, renewed in knowledge after the image of him, and so forth and so on. 12th verse, put on, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved. Put on these garments of righteousness and mercy and kindness and humbleness of mind and meekness and long-suffering. Put them on, just like a clothing. Do something about it. Appropriate what God has for you. Let this mind be in you which is also in Christ Jesus. What was his mind? He humbled himself even to obedience unto death. So put off and put on. Somewhere here there's the phrase put off. Anybody see it? Well, I can find it in Galatians. What? 8th verse? Yeah. But now ye also put off anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communication, and put on. See, put off and put on. Obliterate this. Get it out of the way entirely and put on something else. That's the whole reason for going in to the land of Canaan, to the promised land. The promised land is where we go to learn what God is. It's where we appropriate the mind of God. It's where we put off and put on. Put off the works of the flesh and put on the Spirit. We learn to be godlike. We learn to be Christ-like. We grow in grace and in the knowledge of Jesus Christ in the land. And that'll never happen to us till we decide we want to be in the land. We want to cross over Jordan. We come to Kadesh Barnea and we say, yes, that's what I want. And that's where we learn to do it. And the reason we need to obliterate these tribes is because they'll interfere with that. And they'll keep us from enjoying the land. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that the Amorites stand for some particular thing like pride. Probably that's what Amorite stands for. And the Canaanites just stands for, as I said, just pure moral filth. And I have no doubt but what the Jebusites stand for haughtiness or something like that. But I don't know just exactly. I haven't been able to take and place each one to a particular trait. But I know the gist of what the conglomerate of them stands for. It's those things which our natural self bring us to as it manifests itself. See, we're covetous and this manifests itself in greedy hands. And we're envious and the green eyes flash forth, you see. And all of these things. And this, it's in the land where we learn to put these things off. I'm no doubt, but one of them is a self-assertion, which is just maybe looking at a hot temper in a truer light. To have a hot temper is to be selfish. I assert myself. I will show whoever it is that's crossing me. That's what it really is. Temper is a form of selfishness. It's because it's self-assertion. This is where we learn to put off those things and put on humbleness of mind and so forth in the land. And the 7 tribes in the land tend to keep us from doing that and bring us back so that we don't really, we're in the land, but we don't possess it. Now, it's the job of the tribes around the land to try to keep us out, to start with, and then to dispossess us. See, all of these countries, and this is why I turned to Psalm 83, they weren't just trying to make things unpleasant for Israel while they were in the land, were they? See, you don't hear anything about the Amorites trying to get them out of the land, or the Jebusites trying to get them out of the land. They just made things uneasy for them while they were in the land. But the Moabites and the Philistines and the Ammonites and the Edomites and so forth, they're trying to drive them right into the sea, out of the land. So you see, the tribes inside of the land are trying to keep us from possessing, that is, from having the fulfillment or the enjoyment of what we're supposed to get in the land. Whereas the tribes on the outside, first, it's their attempt to keep us from getting in to start with, and then to dispossess us once we're in. Now, how does a Christian get dispossessed? Well, it's called several things. For instance, when Paul in the 9th chapter, 1 Corinthians, he says, I stay under my body, lest after preaching to others I'll be a castaway or be disallowed in the race. He says, I don't want to be dispossessed out of the land. And when Christ speaks in John chapter 15 of a branch being cut off of the vine, he's not talking about somebody going to hell. He's talking about them no longer having the right to bear fruit unto him, to be dispossessed out of the land. The sin unto death that's described in 1 John chapter 5 is to be dispossessed, or the cutting off of the grafted in branch that you read about in Romans chapter 11, or the field that's burned in Hebrews 6 because it bore continuously thistles and thorns, or the presumptuous sinning, the Christian that sins continually presumptuously, as in Hebrews chapter 10, for if we sin willfully, after having received the knowledge, the epinosis, the full knowledge of the truth, there remaineth no more sacrifice for us, but a fearful looking forward of fiery indignation that shall devour the adversary. That dispossession from the land. What does it mean for a Christian to be dispossessed of the land? That's when a Christian who has committed himself to Christ says, I want to go all the way with him, and who has set his mind to be a part of what God is doing in the world, when he lets these things get to him and make him an unusable servant, so that God says, no, get out of the land. I can't use you anymore. Being dispossessed does not mean going to hell. It means to be put on the shelf, is the term we use. Not being permitted to have a part in God's work anymore. God does this two ways. One is just by taking us out of this world, like he did Samson, or Ananias and Sapphira, or so forth. Or another is like Paul told Timothy about Hymenaeus and Alexander. And what was the other guy that made shipwreck of his faith? Philetus, yes. This is what we're talking about, making shipwreck of your faith. Being dispossessed or no longer permitted. There's two ways that the sin unto death is manifest. One is by actual physical death, and the other is forevermore in this life not being permitted to be brought back into a quickened state so that you can do God's work. This is to be dispossessed. So it's the job of the Philistines and their cohort to dispossess us. It's the job of the Canaanites and their cohort not to dispossess us, but to keep us from being effective and really following through in what God has for us. Now, how do we know this? The whole language of how God describes this. You see, there's so much in the Bible about these tribes. Chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter. When we get into the Amalekites, you're going to say, my, is the whole Bible about Amalekites? And, or you say, my, I think half the Old Testament has to do with Philistines. If you start reading all the chapters that do have to do with them. So let's start back with our little ring around the circle here. And we take these in order as they're mentioned in the wilderness journey. That is the journey when Israel went from Egypt to Canaan. The first mention is of the Philistines, and if you'll follow it through, they're listed in geographical order from west to east and back around north. The first one that's mentioned will be the Philistines in the 13th chapter of Exodus. And then as you go along, I believe in the 16th chapter of Exodus, the next one will be the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekites simply stand for our fleshly nature, not so much as it brings us down into degradation as the Canaanites, but more as it wants to assert itself, its right. It's our old nature asserting itself. I have my right. And it asserts itself in all types of ways. Mostly pride of life or desire for position. I want to be a wheel. That type of a thing. That's what we mean by the flesh when the flesh asserts itself. Now, the end result of that, before pride goeth before a fall, you see, the way it eventually asserts itself is in degradation. But the Amalekites stand for the flesh, our old nature wanting to assert itself. And if we give in to that desire of our old nature to assert itself, we will not go in to the promised land. Then the next tribe that's mentioned of these around this way will be the Midianites. And we'll see that the Midianites stand for structured religion. In other words, rather than counting on God, get it organized. It's sort of like get enough committees going. Somebody said a camel is a horse that a committee put together. I can't help. I know this is sort of making fun of one of the larger denominations, but there's one of the larger denominations that they don't call them committees; they call them commissions. And of course, the difference is the committee comes back and reports, and the commission has power to act. And so I remember I had been chairman of 2 or 3 commissions. This was before I was saved. And I remember one day that our chairman of our board told us that he had good news, that we had a new commission, the whole denomination, and it was the commission for the coordination of commissions. And they asked me if I would be the chairman of the commission for the coordination of commissions. Now that is the Midianites to the epitome. You have to organize everything else, structure it. Now we'll see this when we get to it. The fourth tribe that we'll come to are the Edomites. Now all of these will keep you right out of the promised land. I'll tell you, you let yourself get structured in your religious activity, quote, quote, and you'll never get in, you'll never even make it to the promised land, let alone get dispossessed. Now, the Edomites stand for those who have a religious bent, but when it comes right down to the nitty-gritty, you put material needs above spiritual needs. See, just like Esau did. The Edomites are descendants from Esau. What did he do? He wanted the birthright. He cried up a storm when he found out he didn't get it. But if it came right down to it, he says, what good is a birthright if I die from hunger? It's letting the necessities, the exigencies of life, take away your spiritual life. I can't go to a Bible study or I can't be with God's people because I have to work 70 hours a week. I've got to raise my family, don't I? Mean old God wouldn't give me a job so I could raise my family and attend them to spiritual things too. So since God wouldn't do that for me, I'll just have to give up the spiritual things. This is the attitude of the Edomites. We'll get into that, and you'll see just how it just opens up and blossoms out. The next thing, tribe we run into are the Moabites. And the Moabites are just strictly false Christianity. More like the cult, not like the not like the Philistines that are recognized as the, you might say, the upper strata, the socially accepted ones. But the Moabites are like Jehovah's Witness and Mormonism and all of that stuff. Just pure false cults. And you'll see this. All you have to do is to go to the origin of these things. Have you ever studied the origin, for instance, of Mormonism? The founder of Mormonism was one of the most morally degraded men there ever were. And so was the founder of Jehovah's Witness, or for that matter, a Christian Science. People that had to have some sort of a religious bent in order to compensate for their own guilt. And then people whitewash that over, and they have great big followings. Well, that's Moabitism. And Ammonites are the same thing, but they're a little more way out. Maybe we'd call the Moabites the Christian Scientists and the Ammonites the Jehovah's Witness, something like that, see? But it's the same thing. Now, I've given you 6. And I've always thought that the Amorites that were over on the east side of Jordan were the 7th. They're inside and outside. Stand for pride. But I'm not real sure that maybe they're only supposed to be 6 on the outside. Now, it's 7 on the inside because God says 7. If you want to see it in God's own language, all you have to do is turn to Acts chapter 13, and you don't have to worry about how many you're supposed to put inside. But I don't know of anywhere where it tells Acts 13. Let's see.
Is that 6 in the Ammonites?
Yes. Yes. Acts chapter 13. I had my Bible down, so it took me a while to find it. And now I don't know what verse it is. It's where Paul's preaching here. Let's see. Verse 19. And when he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan. Now, how many nations were in the land of Canaan? You know, I have to wonder. God says 7, see. So, and all we have to worry about then is naming the 7. Of course, if you want them named, well, Moses named them for you in as I said, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1. And many other places, but that's just one place that I can remember that because 7th chapter, 7 tribes.
What were the Ammonites?
I would say about the same as, Ammon and Moab are the same. They're both the sons of, they're both the sons of Lot by his own daughters. They're the same thing, really. There's really no difference between Ammon and Moab. Now for the 7th one. I don't know whether the 7th one are those warlike nations on top like Tyre and so forth, or the Assyrians that are mentioned in Psalm 83, or whether it's something else. I've always thought, when I've taught this lesson before, I've always taught that it's the Amorites who were both inside and outside. And it may be, and then on the other hand, it may only supposed to be 6 instead of 7. You know, we try to make 7 out of everything. Maybe we ought not to make 7 out of it. I can only clearly point and define 6. So maybe you can pick your own 7th one. How's that? Well, you see, the reason I don't know whether we can count Syria or not is because it was not one of the tribes that stood between Israel and the possession of the land. Now, they tried to dispossess Israel, but it's really from another standpoint, and especially when you see that all of these have a kinship to Abraham except the Philistines. And there's a reason, of course, they don't. You see, if you start right back around, Amalek was the grandson of Esau, who was the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham. So he has a kinship. He claims to be something before God. See, you've got to be a son of Abraham in order to have any promise at all. Listen, there's not a single person in this room that has one claim to one promise of God unless you're a son of Abraham. And of course, in Romans chapter 4, in Galatians chapter 3, you are called a son of Abraham. you gain your sonship because you are one with Jesus Christ, who is called in the very first chapter of Matthew, the first verse, the son of David, the son of Abraham. No one has any claim to any promise of God unless he's the son of Abraham. I am a son of Abraham by faith. I gained my sonship. Now you see, I have to be a son of Abraham if I want to have a place of rule that's promised to me by God in the millennium, in the kingdom, because only the sons of Abraham. You remember in the 8th chapter of Matthew when Christ said to the Pharisees, says, you think you're something, you're red hot because you're the sons of Abraham? Well, I want to tell you something. He says, they're going to come from the east and the west, and they're going to sit down on thrones in my kingdom by the side of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the children of the kingdom are going to be cast into outer darkness. Not every son of Abraham has the promise. But to have the promise, you must be a son of Abraham. Now, of course, that's where the Arabs are fouled up, and that's where the Pharisees, they said, we're sons of Abraham. But just to be a son of Abraham doesn't count. You must have other qualifications. But you must be a son of Abraham. And if you're going to be a part of God's kingdom, and of course, everybody who's saved is born into God's kingdom, and not in its manifestation, but you'll be a part of his kingdom in manifestation when he manifests it here on this earth.
Well, Ishmael, then, is not a real son of Abraham.
And yet, he claims to be. See, but in God's terminology, don't you know, God said, Abraham, I will not count Ishmael as your son. And then after that, to emphasize it, he called Isaac, Abraham's only begotten son. He did that in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. You want to see it in the New Testament? Hebrews chapter 11, about verse 19. He calls Isaac, Abraham's only begotten son. He says it's just as though you didn't beget but one son, Abraham, and that's Isaac. And so you've got to be a son of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's got to come all the way. Now you see, all of these have a kinship. The Amalekites were sons of Abraham, and they were sons of Isaac, but they were not sons of Jacob. It didn't count. But they claimed to have the right. As a matter of fact, now every Arab claims to be the son of Ishmael because Mohammed claimed to be. And this is their kinship. And when they recite their little deals, they're the sons of Ishmael, the sons of Abraham. And they make all their claims to a right relationship to God by their sonship to Abraham. Now you see, the Amalekites were true sons of Abraham, but they were false sons of Abraham. They were the physical progeny of Abraham, but not in God's sight, because God rejected Esau. And they were, the Amalekites descended from Esau. And then as we go along again, we find the Midianites. Do you know who Midian was? He was the son of Abraham by Keturah, who Abraham married after Sarah died. Right? So see, from a physical standpoint, the Midianites are sons of Abraham. But they weren't sons of Isaac and Jacob. And then come on around, how about Edom? The Bible says Esau is Edom. He was the son of Isaac and the son of Abraham. But they weren't children of Jacob. They weren't true Israelites. But they had a claimship, see. They had a claim. And then you get on around here to the Moabites. And they were the children of Abraham's nephew, who was Abraham's son by adoption, see. So they claimed to be an adopted son. In all these times, is just as truly a son. And Abraham adopted Lot. And Lot was Abraham's son by adoption. and they claim their kinship from Abraham. They claim to be Christians, God's people, through Christ. You see, and this is another way of saying it, claiming to belong to Christ, Abraham's true son. And so you come around with the same thing of Ammon. So I think if you're going to have a seventh one, he's got to be tied into Abraham. Now, the Philistines don't have to be, because they're strictly professors. You see, they claim to have a place in the land. In fact, the land was named after them. That's how it got its name, Palestine, the land of the Philistines. Palestine is the anglicized word for Philistia. And so their claim is strictly a profession, a spurious claim by the show of their position. You just take, well, let's take all of the hierarchy of what we might call the National Council of Churches. They're not true. I doubt if 1 out of 100 of them is born again. Maybe none of them. I don't know. But they don't talk like they know anything about spiritual perception. They're just the religious hierarchy that's recognized as the possessors of the land. And so the land is called after them. But they have no real claim whatsoever. Well, you'll find it different here. So maybe there's only supposed to be 6. There's 5 that claim kinship to Abraham. And then the Philistines, which are in a little peculiar position. They're really different, as you're going to see all through this. They're different from the rest, and the rest of them are just alike. The rest of them are all trying to shove Israel right out of the land. And that's exactly what Amalekites and Edomites and Midianites and Moabites and Ammonites will do to you. And that's why we want to find out what they're all about. Because they're trying to get you out of the land if you're in the land. And if you're not in the land, they're trying to get you, they keep you out of it or keep you from going into it. Now, if you want to study up a little on the Philistines, obviously we're not going to be able to take all of the Bible stories about the Philistines, but I'll just give you some little goodies, and I may not even give you the scriptures, but I'll show you where you can look. Remember, first we had the story of the Philistines taking away the wells of Abraham, and Abraham knew how to handle them. They don't know how to dig wells.
This was the end of this tape.